Arthur Peterson, an American man over 50, had spent his career in the finance department of a moderately successful mid-sized company. However, his marriage had long since crumbled, and he had endured many hardships in life. One day, he decided to wrap up his affairs and travel the world before it was too late. He had few family ties, and the fact that he had never truly left the United States further spurred him on. After his divorce, his heart felt complicated and bewildered, but at 50 years old, he finally packed his bags and embarked on a journey abroad. Initially, he had considered Southeast Asia or Europe, but suddenly, the Mongolian steppes he'd seen in a documentary clearly came to mind. There, the horizon stretched endlessly, and people still led nomadic lives in an untouched, wild civilization. Arthur wanted to immerse himself in that landscape. He wanted to feel freedom in a strange land. An acquaintance told him that besides urban areas, Mongolia had vast grasslands, deserts, and rugged terrain, making travel very difficult. However, the more he heard, the stronger his curiosity grew. He happened to meet a Mongolian language translator in an online community who informed him that in the western and northwestern regions, there were still some minority tribes with almost no contact with the outside world. Upon arriving in Ulaanbaatar, Arthur slowly began to move westward. He rented a car for his use and learned some basic Mongolian greetings from a translator and dictionary he had prepared in the United States. He anticipated that English proficiency would be low, but he believed there would always be a way to manage. After touring Ulaanbaatar and nearby small towns for a few days, he ventured into more remote areas. As he moved further from the city, the roads became increasingly dilapidated, and his cell phone signal vanished. However, Arthur felt more relief than anxiety. It seemed as though the bustling life in the United States, the wounds from his divorce, and the judging eyes of others had all disappeared. Now, it was just him and the vast expanse of land. After driving for several hours on unpaved roads, a desolate landscape suddenly unfolded. Strong winds howled, dust swirled, and there were no signs of villages except for some dimly visible ridges in the distance. He had brought a certain amount of food, water, and vehicle fuel, but he didn't know when or where a village would appear. A slight fear crept in that he might be isolated in the heart of the steppe. However, from the moment he left, he knew it was a dangerous journey. Wolves or wild dogs roaming the steppe, unpredictable weather, accidents of getting lost, none of it was easy. Arthur opened his map again in the car, trying to find a place where a known landmark might appear, but he had even lost his sense of accurate positioning. Confused by the rugged terrain on this desolate plain where even a fallen needle would be hard to find, he decided to trust his intuition and continue. One afternoon, after driving for another half day, he saw what appeared to be small dots in the distance. Upon closer inspection, it seemed to be a small settlement of several yurts. Arthur was exhausted from the hot sun, but seeing this sight, he felt a wave of relief. If this was a cluster of yurts inhabited by Mongolian nomads, he could at least find people, water, and a place to sleep. As he drove closer, he saw about 8 yurts scattered around. Goats and sheep grazed nearby, and people glanced at him. Arthur slowly got out of the car and greeted them in clumsy Mongolian. He tried to greet them in English, hoping it would be understood, but the reaction was a bit awkward. However, it wasn't an atmosphere of outright repulsion toward strangers. Several people approached and gestured for him to join them. That evening, through clumsy communication, he indicated he was American and traveling. The villagers seemed surprised and offered him roasted lamb and milk tea. Arthur was very grateful and clumsily expressed his goodwill by giving them some American snacks and small souvenirs he carried. This village was a very small tribe. They called themselves the Ordos and said they had long lived a nomadic life centered in this region. Arthur couldn't understand the details, but he roughly gathered their situation through a mix of Mongolian, a few English words, and their gestures. There were almost no young men in the village, mostly children, middle-aged and elderly women, and elders. That night, as he slept in one of the yurts, he wondered, why are there no young men? They might have left for the cities to find work, or there could be other reasons. Arthur simply let it be, without any particular suspicion. He still planned to stay for a day or two and then leave. An unusual proposal. The next morning, the villagers suggested showing him around the village, but Arthur declined. They then gestured to him the well and animal grazing areas, though without fully verbalizing it. Then, in front of one yurt, he discovered 3 young women he hadn't expected. They all appeared to be in their early 20s, much younger than Arthur. They looked very similar, but each exuded a different charm. The first had thick black hair half tied up and appeared tall and serene. The second had brown hair and an impressively bright smile and seemed very lively. The third had neat braids and quietly exchanged glances. Later, he learned these 3 were sisters named Inkjargal, Audril, and Nyamku respectively. A middle-aged woman in the village seemed to be introducing Arthur to the sisters. When Arthur greeted them, the 3 sisters looked at him with curious expressions and smiled. Notably, the second sister, Audril, blurted out a short English hello, to which Arthur replied, "Hello, nice to meet you," eliciting a burst of laughter. It seemed English wouldn't be fully understood, but basic greetings were fine. Thus, he naturally had the opportunity to converse with the sisters. Inkjargal spoke almost no English, making translation difficult, but Audril helped out. She had briefly visited Ulaanbaatar in her childhood and had some exposure to English. The third sister, Nyamku, was shy and spoke little, but she looked at Arthur as one would a stranger. That afternoon, Arthur visited the nearby pastures with the sisters. They also watched the villagers herd livestock across the steppe. Audril explained the village life in simple English. She mentioned the scarcity of men, that most young men had left, and gradually told him about the village's ancient traditions. Arthur was curious. "So how do you marry and have children?" Audril replied with a subtle expression and a smile. "Our tribe has a special custom. Sometimes we have relations with foreign men to procreate. The details are hard to explain." Inkjargal also whispered to her in Mongolian beside her, then gave Arthur a shy smile. At that moment, Arthur felt a chill. There's a custom of having relations with foreign men and bearing children, and here were 3 sisters with almost no young men in the village. He had a ridiculous thought that they might want to ask him to do something similar. However, he just brushed it off as a joke. Could such a thing really happen? Originally, Arthur's plan was to stay in this village for a day or 2, then continue westward. However, the villagers showed warm hospitality, and he wanted to gather more interesting stories while gradually communicating with Audril, so he decided to stay for a few more days, check his car, and stock up on supplies. Furthermore, the weather on the steppe was unpredictable, so resting for a while was also a good idea. Days passed like this. Arthur grew closer to the 3 sisters. None of the 3 were married and were the most promising young women remaining in the family. As the eldest daughter, Inkjargal was responsible for faithfully carrying out the livestock management and household chores assigned by the tribal elders. The lively Audril was curious about external culture and city life, so she constantly asked Arthur about the United States and looked at photos stored on his phone. The youngest, Nyamku, was quiet but often had Audril translate with a gentle smile and a charming tone. Every day, the 3 sisters invited Arthur to their yurt or around the village, had him sit beside them, and showed him various things. He watched with awe the methods of riding horses or goats, the structure inside the yurts, the process of handling firewood, and the making of traditional Mongolian food, which he experienced for the first time. Among them, Inkjargal's meticulous guidance to Arthur was particularly impressive. As the eldest daughter, she tried to explain step by step, and Arthur grew fond of her calm demeanor. One day, at a casual gathering, many village women and some elders watched Arthur and burst into laughter. Arthur didn't know why, but it seemed they were talking about him. Audril, standing next to him, smiled and said, "Foreign men are precious here, especially since there are almost no young men. The villagers think you're remarkable." Arthur smiled awkwardly and nodded. However, Audril stated frankly, "If you allow, we can hold a special ceremony in our village and have children." This left Arthur bewildered. In an instant, his heart sank as he understood what this implied. While it was too early to make hasty assumptions, he couldn't shake the feeling that the sisters might all want him to stay and have children. A life-altering decision. A few days later, Arthur was invited to the 3 sisters' yurt. Before that, he had mainly stayed in a middle-aged couple's yurt, but the sisters requested a long talk in their yurt that night. Inkjargal prepared a special soup using ingredients difficult to obtain in the city. The soup, full of lamb and vegetables, tasted better than he expected, which impressed Arthur. After the meal, Arthur and the three sisters drank tea in the dimly lit yurt, engaging in a fervent conversation. Audrey was responsible for translating. Jargle looked at Arthur with a meaningful gaze and carefully opened her mouth. The following is what was roughly conveyed by Audrey in English. This village has a very ancient family tradition. Due to the absolute shortage of men, when an outsider comes in, he is treated with certain kindness. If the man is willing, several women, such as 3 sisters or 2 sisters, will simultaneously form a relationship with him and bear children. If the man is willing, he can stay with the tribe or leave. Regardless, the children are the responsibility of the women and the village community. The man doesn't have to feel burdened by his children remaining in the village. Of course, if you stay because you feel responsible, the atmosphere will be better. Listening to this story, Arthur could hardly believe it, saying, "Does such a custom truly exist?" Some people in the world had heard that such things occasionally happened, even in some remote parts of Mongolia, but experiencing it directly, he felt it was surreal. But Jargle added, "We are 3 sisters. Each of us lives alone, and in fact, without young men, it's hard for our families to survive. I know this would be a burden for you, but it would be wonderful if we could have children together." This was indeed a bold proposition. Not one but all 3 sisters wanted to have his children. Arthur felt embarrassed and thought to himself, "I'm over 50. This is impossible in America. Besides, I don't know how I'd take responsibility if I actually had children." Audrey, hearing this, said, "We can't force you to stay. This is just an option. If you wish, you can live with us, or you can leave. This is how we've always lived." He had anticipated some of it, but was still shocked to hear it. The 3 sisters looked at Arthur with slightly shy expressions. Nyamku seemed to be quietly lowering her head, her ears slightly reddened. All 3 had beautiful features and healthy complexions, exuding an exotic charm when dressed in traditional Mongolian attire. It was incredible that such sisters simultaneously wanted him to father their children and that this was a custom permitted by the village. Arthur sighed, saying, "I can't refuse, but I can't accept immediately either. This proposal is too unusual." Jargle nodded and said, "We usually don't make such suggestions to foreigners. In fact, long ago, an outsider had a child this way and left. But since then, no men have come for a long time, so we don't want to miss this opportunity either." Audrey said, "Don't feel burdened. If you truly don't want to, you can leave now." Arthur hesitated and asked for some time. The 3 sisters understood, saying, "Please stay a while longer and consider it carefully." However, the village atmosphere already seemed filled with anticipation, as if a foreign man had finally entered their family. He had the impression that if he stayed a few more days, a wedding would naturally take place. His heart was complex. First, he wasn't accustomed to such unconventional relationships. In the conventional American way of thinking, a man marrying 3 sisters simultaneously was absurd. Moreover, he worried about how he would take responsibility if he actually had children. Of course, the tribe allowed men to leave, but Arthur was tormented by the thought of whether he should abandon his own children and depart. However, even if he completely refused, Arthur's own situation was a problem. Back in the United States, he had no special relationships, nor stable work or wealth. If he settled here and started a new life, adapting to the Mongolian language or lifestyle wouldn't be easy, but freely building a family on the steppe was a unique option. The 3 sisters were beautiful and had shown him warm hospitality. Arthur had already grown comfortable with them and secretly developed feelings for them. One day, Jargle quietly visited the yurt where he was staying. It was after everyone else had fallen asleep. Jargle seemed somewhat reserved during the day, but when she spoke quietly at night, she was surprisingly candid. She said, "I know you're over 50, but that's not an issue in the village. Women have united with older men before. What we need is a healthy child to continue the family and trust in a man." Arthur countered, "Are you really okay with this? I'm old, and my body might not be as healthy as it used to be." Jargle laughed and said, "I don't think you're past your prime." After talking with Jargle late into the night, Arthur felt his heart gradually opening. Among the 3 sisters, Jargle possessed a cautious and responsible charm, like an eldest daughter. If he were to live here, he also imagined building a family in cooperation with Jargle. In the following days, Audril approached Arthur more actively. Audril, who spoke English, said casually, "You can leave with me. We can go to the city together." "I want to go to the United States," she suddenly suggested. She was very curious about what the United States was like. Arthur was surprised by this unexpected answer and asked, "Could you really abandon this village?" Audril smiled vaguely and said, "Jargle will protect the village, and Nyamku isn't sure yet, but I'm curious about cities and foreign lands." Nyamku still didn't say much, but her face would quickly redden when Arthur was nearby. Then one day, while fetching water during the day, Nyamku suddenly held Arthur's hand and quietly smiled when they were alone. Arthur's heart pounded, and Nyamku softly mumbled, "I like you too," in a very faint and gentle voice. After all, no more specific words were exchanged, but in that moment, his whole body was filled with excitement. He felt that even without words, her feelings had been conveyed. Arthur ultimately narrowed his choices to two. First, he could refuse the three sisters' request and leave. They had said that without men, it would be difficult to have children and the family would gradually decline, but he wouldn't have to bear responsibility. Second, he could respect their customs and hold a wedding. Even if children were born afterward, the sisters and the village community would care for them, so he wouldn't need to bear the burden. Of course, he could stay and live with them. Deep within him, curiosity and a strange attraction continued to grow. In his 50 years of life, he had never imagined such a thing. In the United States, such a thing would be highly illegal and publicly condemned, and a man marrying three sisters simultaneously was absurd. But here, it was a natural custom. Moreover, the three sisters were all pure and beautiful. They were very amiable. Most importantly, Arthur himself was tired of his past work life and married life and wanted to find a new life, so perhaps this was destiny. Finally, he conveyed his intentions to the three sisters through Jargle. "If you truly wish it, and if I am capable, I will follow that custom." Upon hearing these words, the three sisters were overjoyed, embracing him and covering their eyes. It was as if a long-standing mission had been resolved. Arthur tried to remain calm on the surface, but his heart was pounding. The thought of what he was doing swept through his body. A new family on the step. After that, the village elders immediately began preparations. Originally, when such a wedding was held for a family, they would share food like a simple festival, playing traditional music and dancing. This case was somewhat unusual. A man marrying three sisters simultaneously was rare, but this also meant that this family could be grandly welcomed. One day, a large bonfire was lit in the center of the steppe. Elders and women representing the families sat in a circle, beating drums and other percussion instruments, and reciting words of congratulation. About 30 villagers gathered, and the three sisters surrounded Arthur in the center. They wore coats similar to traditional attire, without complex decorations, but adorned with bright Mongolian-style colors. The ceremony wasn't long. The elders simply spoke a few words of congratulation. The brides bowed gently to Arthur and then circulated cups. Arthur also drank a golden beverage, like the village's traditional wine. His stomach grew warm. People clapped their hands with joyful smiles, and the drumbeats grew louder. Lamb, bread, and milk tea were immediately served, and like a simple feast, some people also danced. The festivities continued after sunset, and Arthur moved with the three sisters to a specially prepared yurt on one side of the village. Several people had already come here and arranged it meticulously. They had created a space large enough for the three sisters and one man to live together. Arthur, with a slightly flushed face, said, "Jargle, from today on, you will live with us." Audril then smiled and said, "From now on, we are a family." "Isn't that wonderful?" Nyamku quietly nodded, but her eyes sparkled. As night deepened, moonlight and lantern light flickered within the yurt. The three sisters sat beside Arthur, won by Oni night unimaginable in his former American life. Jargle, looking at him, said, "We are not greatly influenced by things like order or rules. However, you only need to be considerate of each other. I hope to have a child, but it's not compulsory." Arthur nodded with a nervous yet excited heart. Their cohabitation thus began. The first few days were unfamiliar and cautious, but gradually settled into a routine. The three sisters took turns spending nights with Arthur, and they also chatted together. Ingjärgl had a serious and guardian-like presence. Audril was energetic and charming, while Nyamku was shy but would occasionally give him a friendly physical touch. For Arthur, every day was a heart-pounding one, unsure of what would happen. About a month later, Arthur began to live with the sisters and actively participate in village affairs. When the sisters were mobilized to feed livestock, maintain yurts, fetch water, and harvest herbs in the mountains, he also worked alongside them. In the process, he often heard people jokingly say that he was now completely their family's son-in-law. He also felt the village atmosphere trying to accept him like a brother, regardless of age. Sometimes Ingjärgl would take Arthur to the steppe to practice horseback riding. As he calmly rode a horse and galloped across the steppe, the vast land and sky seemed to merge. Arthur recalled his previous life in the United States, buried among skyscrapers, and thought it was the first time he had felt such freedom. Audril was always smiling and often asked Arthur, "Do you have American food? Show me American pop music videos on your smartphone." Since there was no internet signal in the village, he could only show saved files. Audril watched the videos with great interest and happily said, "I want to wear clothes like that too." Arthur said, "If I have the chance to go back to the United States, I'll definitely take you." And Audril's eyes lit up, shouting, "Promise." Nyamku remained quiet, but sometimes when she was alone with Arthur, she would become very endearing, especially when he helped with firewood or laundry. She would quietly come over and hand him a small handkerchief, saying, "Are you tired? Take a rest." Whenever this happened, Arthur felt overwhelmed. The three were different, but they all gave him care and love. 3 miracles. One day, Ingjärgl said she had been feeling nauseous and vomiting since morning. At first, he thought nothing of it, but after a day or two, she was examined by an elderly woman in the village. The result was pregnancy. Ingjärgl was shocked, as if by a bolt from the blue, but at the same time, she also showed a look of relief. Finally, a child was coming. According to family tradition, this was a very good thing, and in fact, Ingjärgl herself had been waiting for the time of childbirth. Ingjärgl made a loving joke to Arthur, saying, "It seems you've sown your seeds well." Arthur was startled, thinking in shock, "Am I really going to be a father?" He thought the probability was low because of his age, but before the mysteries of nature, human calculations were futile. But this joy was short-lived, as a few days later, Audril also complained of similar symptoms. Audril joked with a laugh, "I wonder if I'm pregnant too." But when the elderly woman examined her, it was indeed pregnancy. He could hardly believe it. Arthur was speechless for a moment. Ingjärgl and Audril were confirmed pregnant, with only a half-month interval. The sisters embraced, cheering excitedly while massaging their bellies. A family celebration erupted. The youngest, Nyamku, was also confirmed pregnant about a month later. Not long after, all 3 sisters were pregnant in quick succession. Arthur himself could hardly believe this was possible. Although already over 50, he not only had 1 child, but was having children with 3 sisters. "The sisters are truly a miracle," he said with tears in his eyes, expressing gratitude. The villagers were immersed in a festive atmosphere. It was said that 3 children were coming at once, so they held a feast, even preparing a cow to mark the occasion. The elders were delighted, saying, "It's been a long time since such a golden age." Arthur felt embarrassed by the attention of the whole world focused on him, but at the same time, he also felt proud and responsible. In the early stages of pregnancy, they all experienced morning sickness, fatigue, and dizziness. Arthur carefully looked after them. He reduced his other tasks and did his best to ensure the sisters had no difficulties with food and followed the prenatal care methods taught by the village elders. Most importantly, providing prenatal care for 3 pregnant women simultaneously in an inland village rather than a city hospital was difficult. However, this place had a long-standing knack for childbirth without external medical care. People were optimistic that women who had delivered children for decades could do so without any major issues. The sisters seemed filled with joy, even though they complained of some discomfort. As their bellies gradually grew, they would gather every day to chat, saying, "We'll be having babies soon." Every evening, as Arthur talked with the 3 sisters, he felt complex emotions. When he felt happy and excited, the question, "Am I really going to live here forever?" kept surfacing. The sisters said, "You don't have to stay forever, but it would be great if you could live with us for a few years after the children are born. It would be too difficult for us to manage on our own." They said honestly. Nyamku shyly said, "I initially said you could leave, but actually all three of us hope you'll stay in the village." Arthur was swayed. "Okay," he said. "I promise not to leave for now." A few more days passed, and when Ingjargul, Adril, and Nyamku were about 4 to 5 months pregnant, a sandstorm and other natural disasters struck the village. Yurts shook, and livestock were startled and ran off. The sisters had to endure the chaos in their heavy state. Arthur quickly drove, moving the goats and sheep to a safe place, and removed rolling stones around the yurts, carrying out protection efforts. Thanks to this, they passed through without major damage, but the sisters were so surprised that they felt they had hovered between life and death. That night, all three embraced Arthur, murmuring, "What would we do without you?" Arthur comforted his sisters, saying, "I will protect you. I will do my best no matter the circumstances." He cherished them even more as each of the three was carrying a child. The entire village clearly showed its dependence on him. Finally, the delivery dates approached. First, Ingjargul felt labor pains with her full belly, and the elderly women prepared in the yurt, using simple birthing methods. Arthur's hands and feet trembled nervously, but as he saw Ingjargul struggling in immense pain, he felt the urge to do something. Fortunately, the elderly woman with decades of experience guided the entire process well, and after a few hours, the strong cry of a baby was heard. A baby was born. Ingjargul's hair was disheveled with sweat, but she smiled faintly as she held the baby. Arthur's eyes also grew hot, and he was speechless. His memory of perhaps having experienced childbirth once in the United States resurfaced, but this was now a child born in a completely different environment with a completely different woman. He was overwhelmed by the infinitely tiny and mysterious life. A few weeks later, Adril also gave birth to a child through a similar process. It was said that, true to her lively self, even during labor pains, she would mix in jokes like, "Save me, I'm dying," which made people laugh. As soon as the baby was born, she almost lost all her strength, but upon hearing the baby's cry, she immediately sobered up. "I can't believe this is my baby." Adril shed tears as she caressed the baby's fingers. Arthur also watched nervously nearby this time, and when it was all safely over, his legs almost gave out. Finally, the youngest, Nyamku, gave birth to a child. The three babies were born with approximately 3 months between each birth. Nyamku didn't make much noise during labor pains, as she wasn't very vocal. Instead, she held back her tears, and whenever the elderly women said, "You must be more energetic, don't cry, give me strength," she quietly complied, and at a certain moment, the baby came into the world. Nyamku embraced the baby and said, "Arthur, you did well. You're truly wonderful," and tightly squeezed his hand. Finally, the bride successfully gave birth to each child. It was a series of births happening at different times, but all within just a few months. The village was overjoyed, reaching a fever pitch. 3 babies being born in such a short time was excellent, meaning future generations would become even more prosperous. They congratulated them, saying the family's life had grown stronger. Arthur felt the joy and responsibility of becoming a father. Honestly, it was hard to believe he was raising 3 newborns, but thanks to the sisters' unity and the village community's help, things progressed smoothly. Every morning, he would be woken by the baby's cries, but his fatigue would disappear when he saw the children adorably suckling. Now, the brides and Arthur lived in the same yurt, caring for the 3 children together. Since the babies woke up in shifts every night, the 3 sisters took turns caring for one baby, and sometimes Arthur would hug and comfort 1 or 2. This was a situation he could never have imagined in the United States, but here it was common for several people to live in one yurt, and because the entire family raised the children together, it was less difficult. Naturally, Arthur became very busy. Early in the morning, while the sisters were feeding the babies, he would go out of the village to chop firewood or tend to the livestock. When Arthur returned, the sisters would report, "You've worked hard. Our babies are doing such and such today." The village elders would occasionally come to check on the baby's health and praise Arthur, saying, "He truly is a remarkable man." He's still working so hard at his age. Sometimes Audril would hum American pop songs to lull the babies to sleep. Jargle, like a mature adult, would responsibly plan even while raising the children, worrying about how to prepare clothes when they were slightly older or how to obtain milk or formula. Nyamku quietly and silently watched the babies, and at some point, she would quietly tell Arthur that she was grateful for him embracing the family's children so fully. Life on the steppe and beyond. In such daily life, Arthur felt he was being reborn. He had shed his divorce pain and stagnation from the United States and built a completely different family in a completely different place. Furthermore, with 3 newborns born carrying his seed simultaneously, he had become the center of a large family he had never imagined. Sometimes he would miss civilization. He thought of food from his homeland, the United States, comfortable shower facilities, and internet connection, but the innocent smiles of the sisters and children made the regrets disappear. Moreover, there was no fierce competition here, no worries about money, and no corporate superiors. Of course, there was difficult physical labor and the danger of natural disasters, but there was a warmth of communal living here. As the newborns became more stable and postpartum recovery was achieved, Arthur began seriously discussing long-term residence with his sisters. Now that the children were growing a bit, shouldn't they consider city life for their education and in other aspects? Audril actively agreed. I want to live in the city once and teach the children to write. Jargle cautiously agreed, saying, our village has no schools or hospitals, so moving to the city or at least closer to a town might be the right thing to do at some point. Nyamku also nodded slightly. However, the issues were money and legal matters. Even if they only moved within Mongolia, they would have to go to Ulaanbaatar to find housing or rooms, and living expenses wouldn't be easy either. Furthermore, if Arthur was considering going back to the United States, complicated administrative procedures such as the children's birth certificates and the sisters' visas could become a problem. Jargle said, if you're willing, I'd like to go abroad with you, but all 3 of us would have to go at the same time, and with 3 children. She shook her head. Arthur thought it wasn't the stage to make a decision yet. First, let's let the children do better here and discuss it in detail again when they're a bit older and can travel. I can go back to the United States to prepare a certain amount of money, or I can first live in a Mongolian city, he suggested. The sisters all agreed with this viewpoint. The village elders also said, if raising the children becomes inconvenient for you, you can leave for the city on your own. We wish for you to stay, but we respect your freedom. Arthur was somewhat moved by these words, and on the other hand, he also felt apologetic. Even if he were to leave one day, would they be okay? However, they seemed adaptable, as they had long experienced situations where outside men came in and only left behind children. Ultimately, Arthur, the brides, and the newborns lived as one large family under one roof, continuing the village's communal life. When the babies were about 1 year old, it was noisy and bustling, but Arthur felt happy seeing the sisters take turns caring for them. Here was a peaceful family harmony he couldn't have achieved in the United States. These days, he would sometimes drive an SUV to areas near the city or at least find a hospital in town to get them vaccinated. Each time, the 3 sisters and 3 children accompanied him. The car was crowded. At the hospital, the doctor smiled and said, oh, a father having 3 newborns at once. That's truly amazing. Arthur's language wasn't very fluent, but he could communicate roughly because the sisters would translate. Thus, he gradually interacted with external civilization. Even in the village, with 3 babies born, there was much energy. The adults were very satisfied, remarking that after a long time, the house was finally filled with the cries of children. Arthur had also reached a stage where he didn't hesitate to exchange drinks and jokes with several people in the village. He was no longer a traveler who stayed for only a few days and left. He felt he was now a true member. Sometimes at night, he would build a fire in front of the yurt and gaze at the stars, thinking, how did my life unfold this way? I simultaneously gained the freedom I so yearned for and new love and responsibilities. Even in strong winds, with the brides beside him, the yurt where the children slept felt like a sanctuary that couldn't be exchanged for anything in the world. The noisy and complex civilization seemed long forgotten, and the Mongolian land and wind embraced him. Sometimes he felt disheartened because he had no place to return to, but now, at least in this place, he had 3 wives and 3 children, a family. When he thought of this, his heart would warm, and he felt a new sense of responsibility and hope. This family would continue for decades until the children grew up, and this inland region would care for them. In the inland regions of Mongolia, the seasons flow harshly. In winter, temperatures can drop to tens of degrees below zero, and in summer, heat and sandstorms strike. Nomads have adapted and live within these conditions. Similarly, Arthur, his 3 sisters, and their children might face many trials in the future. The children might fall ill, financial difficulties might arise, or natural disasters might occur. But they would overcome it hand in hand, in the name of family and by uniting with the customs and community spirit of this Mongolian tribe. Now, a newborn cried in the yurt, and the sisters busily comforted him, while Arthur also got up to help. When Audril called out, "I'll hold you today, so go comfort Nyamka's baby," Jargle said, "I'll prepare the meal." Their appearance was somehow chaotic, but it was a warm and ordinary daily life of a family there. A family dynamic completely different from the normal framework in the United States existed, yet it was filled with sincerity, caring for and cherishing each other more than anyone else. Life continued thus, deep in Mongolia's boundless steppe. The sun set, and at night, glittering stars covered the entire sky. Beneath it, in a yurt lit by a small lamp, resided a man in his 50s who had once been trapped in isolation, and his brides who formed the family he now had to protect. Now there were also 3 infants who had just come into this world. This family, which seemed strange at first glance, had actually transformed into a precious relationship for each other. The ending remained uncertain. This family might experience many stories and choices, but one thing Arthur realized: life is only once, and if you can achieve love and unity in any way, that is enough to be worthwhile. His encounter with the 3 sisters brought him the freedom he had been seeking and another form of responsibility. This was enough to change his life thereafter. As a result, an unconventional relationship that began with a foreigner's visit ultimately brought new vitality to inland Mongolia. The sisters each successfully continued their family line by bearing children, and the villagers also blessed them. Arthur was also considered a member of the village and gradually took root in this land. One day, even if the children grew up and left to explore the wider world, the dedication formed on the steppe, in the yurt, and with his new family would never change. Perhaps one day Arthur would take the children to the United States. At that time, people around them might be surprised, saying, "Impossible, a man with 3 sisters and children." But isn't life always an unpredictable adventure? At this moment, stars twinkled over the steppe, and the yurt was filled with warmth and the laughter of family.